Welcome everyone to the second installment of Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society. Today is Tuesday, January 24th. We are behind in our recordings of the lectures. I would like to say one or two words about this before we move forward. This situation was beyond my control. The decision to have this online course was made actually sometime back in November, but I don't know why it took them so long to set this in place. I just started working at FIU, and so there was also an element of getting to know a new institution, but we will rectify this matter. I will be recording a bunch of lectures today and uploading them. And so hopefully we will be up to date by the end of the day today. I trust that by now everyone has been able to get a copy of the textbook, A New Introduction to Islam by Daniel Brown. Please note this is the third edition. This is a paperback copy of the book. There are, I'm sure, people nowadays, students nowadays are quite resourceful. You may well be able to get your hands on some kind of a soft copy by other means, and you are certainly free to do that. So today I would like to talk a little bit more about the very first chapter, which talks about Islam and global perspective and sort of tries to introduce the entire study of the subject. And there is a discussion at the very end of the book. Sorry, not at the end of the book, at the end of the first chapter. In the print copy of the book, that would be on pages 16 through 17, that refers to essential resources for the study of Islam. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these sources. Most of them would probably not be too accessible. I don't know if they even have them in the library, but we won't really be needing them for this course. I just want to make them known and just say a few words about them for anyone who wants to conduct their own investigation and their own reading at any point. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the different translations of the Qur'an which are out there, which are extremely important for anyone who's trying to understand the Islamic religion. And then I want to say a few words about the study of Islam in particular in the Western world, as well as the study of religion in the Western world and how that affects the study of Islam, and that will conclude this second lecture. Under essential resources for the study of Islam, Daniel Brown mentions a number of key reference works which are absolutely fundamental in the field of Islamic studies. To really be frank, however, most of these are for specialists or for people who are looking to become specialists in Islamic studies, which is not to say that they are not that they are useless for undergraduates or for people who are just newly coming to the subject, but they're not very easy to use. And I'll tell you why. So the first of these is the Encyclopedia of Islam. The Encyclopedia of Islam has undergone a number of different editions. So the first edition is usually referred to as EI1. And I think that they started working on that, in the early part of the 20th century. It was issued in 3 languages, in English, French, and German. And it's a very, very useful book if you know how to use it. The problem is that if you want to, let's say, find out about Muslim prayer, you can't look under P, the letter P for prayer. You actually have to know the Arabic word for prayer in Islam, which is salah or salat. And that's how it goes with most topics. And they brought out a second edition, which is generally referred to as EI2, or it's even called the New Encyclopedia of Islam. Oh, sorry, I have a cat. She just jumped up here. And that was coming out in the end of the 20th century and almost into the 21st. I was in graduate school back in the 1990s, and they had just reached the letter M. Now it's finished. Again, you can access that. Now, the good thing, though, is that all of these encyclopedias, both of these versions, are available online. You don't actually have to have a hardcover copy, but you can only access the online version if your institution or if you yourself have paid the access fee. I'm not sure if FIU is subscribing to that or not. It's pretty expensive. But if you have the online capability, you can search all sorts of things. Again, unfortunately, even in this edition, they stuck to this idea that you have to, almost always have to know the Arabic word for a thing, which is a very weird way of going about it, but nevertheless, it's out of my control. That's what they did. They also have a strange way of writing things in the English alphabet that are Arabic words. So typically the word Qur'an, the holy book of the Muslims, is typically spelled with a Q, but they spell it with a K, with a dot under it. And so it's very confusing. So then they began a third version of it, which they call Encyclopedia of Islam 3. And they actually write out the word 3, T-H-R-E-E. That's online. They have reformed that, so to speak. And so you don't have to know Arabic terms to look up to find what you need. Then there is another really important encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia Iranica. Most of that is available online at the website Iranica Online. There's also an encyclopedia of the Qur'an. That's very useful. And that doesn't have the shortcomings of the Encyclopedia of Islam. It's also published by E.J. Brill. Again, that's also available online. But most of these things are not going to be important in our course. I'm just mentioning them if you want to follow up on any references. There's a bunch of other things which are mentioned here. I'm going to talk about just one or two of them, which I think are particularly useful and accessible. If you're interested in the history of Islam, you can't do better than Marshall Hodgson's The Venture of Islam, which is a 3-volume history of Islam as a world civilization. There is a very accessible reader on Islam, one by Peters called A Reader on Classical Islam, that has translations of lots of texts and is very accessible. The reason the books like F.E. Peters' A Reader on Classical Islam are important or useful is because, unfortunately, most of the Islamic intellectual tradition remains in Arabic and other Islamic languages. The most important languages in Islamic civilization are Arabic, in the following order: Arabic, Persian, and then Turkish, I would say, but the old form of Turkish, which is called Ottoman Turkish. And then I would say Urdu, and I would also add to the list Classical Malay. So most of the important things in the Islamic world still remain in untranslated, and this is a major problem and a major issue. So when you have that situation, it's good if you have some sort of an anthology that has lots of translated texts. So this is one reason why books like Peters are important. However, when it comes to the most important book for understanding Islamic civilization, that, of course, is the Qur'an. And in that case, we are very fortunate that there are many, many, many translations of the Qur'an available in most of the major languages of the world. There's many translations in English, there's translations in German, there's translations in Spanish, and there's translations in the languages which you find in the Muslim world, like Persian, Urdu, Turkish, Malay, Indonesian, Swahili, you name it. So there's scarcely a language in which the Quran hasn't been translated. There's a Russian translation, there's Polish, there's Bulgarian, there's Kazakh, Uyghur, Serbian, Croatian, Czech, Japanese, Chinese, different translations. There's a Tagalog translation, which is language in the Philippines, one of the languages in the Philippines. I mean, there's even sort of what you would think would be maybe unusual languages. There are translations of the Quran in Sanskrit. There's more than one. There are translations into Hebrew, more than one. So, I mean, I can't really think of a language in which the Quran has not been translated. Even so-called certain dead languages, there's many translations of the Quran into Latin. I am absolutely certain that there are no translations in dead ancient languages. What would be the point? I mean, there's no Babylonian translation of the Quran, for example. So there are many translations. So let's discuss briefly about the English translations. But first, just to give you an idea, what is the Quran in the original? It's not a huge book. So here is a copy of the Quran in Arabic. And Muslims do, as an act of worship, ritually recite the Quran in Arabic. And this is just one of the most common, widespread printed editions of the Quran in the Muslim world. It's printed in Saudi Arabia. And you find this sort of this green cover and this design all over the Muslim world. It's about 600 pages. Let's actually see exactly how many pages in this. I'm pretty sure it's like 602 or something. Yeah. So the actual text runs from page 1. It does start on page 1 up to page 604. I mean, if you can read Arabic, you can see that 604. And even in America, this is the printed version, printed copy of the Quran that you would find in most mosques. So it's not a very huge book. You see, it's about as big as my hand. Okay, maybe I have a big hand, but it's not really a very large book. So what are the most important translations? Before I get into that, the Quran consists of about 114 chapters, and we'll have more to say about this in the chapter from the textbook on the Quran, but just very quickly, it has 114 chapters, and some of them are only a line or two long, maybe only a few verses, and they'll barely fit on a line or two. And then the longest chapter in the Quran stretches over many, many pages and has more than 200, almost 300 verses in it. I think 286. So that is the Quran in Arabic. There are many English translations, as I've said. Among the most famous and most common in the US is a translation by someone named Abdullah Yusuf Ali. It's gone through many, many, many editions. I'm not exactly sure when it first came out, but it came out in the middle of the early years of the 20th century, like the 1930s. And there are many editions of this. This is, when I was a kid in the US growing up, this was the most common translation of the Quran in the English language. And like I said, it's gone through many editions. When Abdullah Yusuf Ali translated this, he had a huge number of notes. And so in this edition, they've taken the notes out. Otherwise, it's very thick because of his notes and comments. Abdullah Yusuf Ali was from India, and this is one of the most common translations of the Quran, which you will find particularly in the American Muslim community. And I'll say a few words about each translation. First of all, you should understand that Arabic is a pretty complicated language, and we'll have a lot to say about that in our next lecture on Arabia and the Arabic language. It's a very difficult language. It's got a lot of grammar rules. We would say that it's a highly inflected language, meaning that depending on the grammatical case of the nouns, the endings change. And it's a very beautiful language. It has a very rich literature. And the Quran is universally regarded by Arabs, even non-Muslim Arabs, as representing the pinnacle of Arabic eloquence. So it's not easy to translate this book. And I spent many, many years learning and studying Arabic, but it's something you never master. But I have put in a lot of time. And there is quite a difference between the classical written language and the spoken language. So depending on where you go in the Arab world, there's many different dialects, just like there's many different dialects of Spanish. You know, there's a Mexican Spanish, a Cuban Spanish, a Honduran Spanish, a Puerto Rican Spanish. So Arabic is like that as well. But in the Qur'an, you don't have that. You have this kind of very high classical language. So I have spent a lot of time, studying these different translations and using them in my own work. If I'm writing any kind of scholarly paper in my subject area, I tend not to use any translations. I just translate it myself. I've not translated the entire Qur'an, but whenever I need to, I translate whatever part I need. So Abdullah Yusuf Ali, I think, is, I really don't like this translation for many reasons. I think in certain places he has taken liberties. Maybe that's inevitable. Taking liberties means he's sort of offered a kind of interpretation, which to some degree is inevitable when you translate, but it's a very fine line, and I think in some cases he's crossed it without going into examples. Another drawback of this translation is that the language is very sort of old-fashioned. Much like the language found in the classical sort of English translation of the Bible, which is known as the AV, the Authorized Version, also known as the King James Version. So there's lots of thous and these and so forth. And I think that for the modern the modern English-speaking reader, that can sometimes present a burden or a hardship to understanding. Okay, let's put that one over here. Another translation, which is very much on the same level in some ways, it came out around the same time, is called here they actually changed it. It's actually called The Meaning of the Glorious Qur'an, but on the cover they've got the Glorious Qur'an. And again, this has undergone many, many, many printings. This is by a British convert to Islam named Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. I think that he has really tried to be very accurate in this. I think he's much more accurate than Abdullah Yusuf Ali. This edition first was published in India during the British period in what was then independent of Britain, known as the princely state of Hyderabad in central India, under the auspices of the Muslim ruler of that independent kingdom, who was called the Nizam of Hyderabad. This is, I think, a very good translation. I like it. I often refer to it. However, here also we have the issue, excuse me, of the nature of the language. So this too came out, I think, the first time sometime in the 1930s. And the translator also had this kind of very classical English with the thous and these and thines. And so that can present a hamper or a hurdle to understanding by modern readers, English-speaking readers of these translations. But I do like Pickthall. I think he really knew the Arabic language very well, and he did a really good job despite the English issue, which I just talked about. There are some other translations of in the same vein with the these and thines. This was a thing which I think many of these early Muslim translators were trying to do because they were very much influenced in their English by the English language in the King James Version of the Bible. So Marmaduke Pickthall was a Sunni Muslim. And this distinction between Muslims, between Sunni and Shiite, is a very big deal. And we'll have a lot more to say about it later in the course. What a lot of people don't know is that Abdullah Yusuf Ali actually was from a Shia background. But it's very clear that he, maybe he became Sunni or whatever, but it's not really clear to me exactly. There's a biography of him, and he doesn't seem to have any sort of Shiite leanings, but he did come from that background. So there is another translation into English, which is very much in the style of Yusuf Ali, with the these and thines and so forth, and with a lot of comments. And it's simply called the Holy Quran, Arabic text with English translation and commentary. And this is by someone named Mir Ahmad Ali. Mir Ahmad Ali, SV Mir Ahmad Ali. Oh my, there you go. And as you can see, it's rather large work because he has this is more than just a translation of the Qur'an. This is commentary as well. So here you have the Arabic on one side, you've got the English translation, you have footnotes, and some places he has a lot of notes, like over here on this other side of the page, you can see. So this is a translation which is very popular even now among Shia Muslims. Okay, let's put that aside. Let's look at some more modern translations. This is a very useful translation of the Quran. It's just called Al-Quran, and it says subtitle, a contemporary translation by Ahmad Ali. Ahmad Ali was from Pakistan, and he was a very talented translator of literary works from Urdu into English, and he brought out this translation of the Quran into which he put a lot of work. And in some places, I think this translation is really great. This is published by Princeton University Press. I bought this when I was a student there at a book sale, very cheap, and it's got a nice cover and so forth. So I think this translation is extremely readable for modern readers. Okay, let's look at another one. Another modern and very accessible translation of the Quran is the one by Abdullah Nuruddin Durki. And you can see he's got always has the Arabic on one page and the translation on another. And this edition has the distinction of having all of the Arabic text written out in English alphabet for people who can't read Arabic, because Muslims have to recite the Quran in Arabic. And if they can't read, especially if they don't know the Arabic alphabet, well, this helps them. And it's got the Arabic text, but written in English letters, which is called transliteration. And this one goes from right to left. So you can see it's got this Arabic cover page. This is a very useful translation as well. It goes by the name of the Tajweedi Qur'an. You can see on the spine it says the Tajweedi Qur'an. Tajweedi means that the Tajweed refers to the special way of reciting the Quran. There's a certain voice that you have to, it's not music, but it can be, it has a musicality to it. So there's a way of melodiously reciting the Quran, and that subject is known as tajweed. So this is a very readable translation. This one is available free. If you look around online, you can download a free PDF. Now let's talk about some modern translations. So there is one called the Sublime Qur'an. This is a paperback version with the English only in it, which you can get very cheap. I bought it on Amazon. When it first came out, it was published with the Arabic text, but I couldn't get a copy at that time. I didn't live in the US, and it was hard to get a hold of. So this is also the revised edition. It's by Lale Bakhtiar. May Allah have mercy on her soul. She was a very kind woman. I met her a few times. She was half Iranian, half American, and she really worked hard on this translation. I should tell you that this is a so-called feminist translation. Lale Bakhtiar was a so-called Islamic feminist. What that means is a whole other subject. There's different kinds of people who call themselves Islamic feminists, Islamic feminism. We'll talk about that at the end of the course. But this is a very useful translation because she looks at the grammar very closely and how the pronouns work, not pronouns in the modern sense with all this debate going about, what are my pronouns, kind of pronouns, but pronouns from a linguistic point of view, because they are important in, shall we just say, in Arabic, because sometimes you'll have a reference to a thing by means of a pronoun. And anyhow, so this has a kind of linguistic dimension to it, which I found this to be very interesting as someone who's also a practitioner of translation and has studied Arabic. I found this to be quite interesting, although I pretty much disagree with a lot of this translation, but it's still an extremely useful exercise. I don't you might find it strange, but I've never met a translation of the Quran, so to speak, which I quote unquote didn't like, in the sense that I have a tremendous amount of respect for anyone, Muslim, non-Muslim, who has put in the time to translate such a difficult book. And I think there's something to be learned from every translation if you know Arabic and if you study the Quran. So I have a lot of translations. I'm just showing you a few which I have nearby. I have many more in other places in my house and boxes and stuff. So let's conclude with what I think is one of the most interesting translations of the Quran in the English language. And this is the translation by a very, very interesting and complicated man by the name of Muhammad Asad. It's called The Message of the Quran. This was first published in 1980. Muhammad Asad was a very complicated man. He was born into a Jewish family, actually a family of Jewish rabbis. He was born in the city of Lvov, which at the time was probably in Poland or Austria. Now I think it's in Ukraine, and in Ukrainian, I believe they pronounce it more like Lviv. And yeah, so he was born in the early part of, if I'm not mistaken, may even have been in the 19th century, or the very, very early first years of the 20th century. And he became a correspondent at a very young age for a very important paper which was published in Germany called the Frankfurter Zeitung, the Frankfurter Zeitung. And he became a Middle East correspondent. You have to remember that the Middle East at that time this is just after the First World War. And so he was in the Middle East, so-called Middle East or Near East in the 1920s, and he met a lot of the personalities there. And he was very impressed with the Arabic language and with the religion. And for whatever reasons, he became a Muslim. If you're curious to read about his life, he wrote an autobiography called The Road to Mecca, in which he sets out some of the background and the story to his conversion. And then later he actually left Arabia and ended up in India, and later ended up in the new nation of Pakistan after the partition, and actually became a citizen of that country and served in their diplomatic service and actually worked at the United Nations. And in the 50s, people were very curious about him. And so he wrote his biography, and then he spent his rest of his years after that working for decades on this translation of the Quran. Now, what I find interesting in this is the English in many places is really quite good. It reads very, very well. And he has many, many notes, most of which I disagree with for any number of reasons. They offer his own interpretation. He was a kind of a modernist, shall we say, and he has some very peculiar takes in some places in this translation. Again, without getting into examples, it would be too complicated. Nevertheless, I think it's a very interesting translation. In many places, it reads absolutely beautifully. And so these are the main translations of the Quran, these are the translations of the Quran which I wanted to talk about. They just happen to be some of my particular favorites, which I do refer to quite often. There is another one which I don't have a copy of handy for this video, but I'm not sure where it is. And that one is the translation. Most of these translations are known by the name of the translator, and they usually have very similar titles, like the message of the Quran, the noble Quran, the meaning of the glorious Quran, things like this. So I'm not sure what particular title this gentleman gave, but he's a contemporary, and his name is Ali Quli Qarai, A-Q Qarai, Q-A-R-A-I. That's also a very useful translation, and he has both the Arabic and the English in the original edition, and he has each Arabic phrase on one side of a page with a column, and then he puts the English that corresponds to that phrase. So if you're learning Arabic, it's very useful. I should say that translator is a 12er Shiite. He's like Mir Ahmad Ali. So that's another Shia translation of the Quran. Now, there is a website, let's just double check, where you can access every single one of these except the Nuruddin Turki translation online. Let me just check. What is the URL? Yeah, it's al-quran.info. al-quran.info. alquran.info. And you can go and set your preferences on that website, and you can choose which translations you want to see. And you can just type in a verse and go boom. And let's say you can even choose, I think you can choose up to 7 translations, and you have them all in one place. Oh, there's one I forgot. Let me just say this one also. Yeah, this one is also on that website. So I just want to say this one as well, and then we'll move on. This is very readable. It's in very simple English. And it is by Abdul Haq and Aisha Billi. And it's called The Noble Qur'an. And alquran.info is the only place you can find an online version. Otherwise, it only sells in hardcover. It's really expensive. It's like $40. And that was actually, I bought this 2 years ago. So it's a very, very simple English words. In some places, they keep Arabic words because they intended this to be a translation mainly for Muslims. So there's certain words which they don't bother translating, which would be known to a Muslim, like Hajj, the pilgrimage, for example, Iman, faith. They don't translate those words. And it has some interesting features. So, all right, so let's move on. So much for the different translations of the Quran. So I encourage you to look in that website and use it anytime. There are quotations from the Quran in this book. Maybe you should, it's very easy to go online and see what's there, and feel free to browse, because the Quran, as I said, the Arabic is pretty complicated. And sometimes there's a significant difference between translations. And it can maybe change the meaning, because some of these words in Arabic are subject to more than one meaning. So, it's important, if you don't know the language in particular, to look at different translations. All right, so I've spoken about different sources for the study of Islam, reference works, which you could access online if you're curious. I've talked about translations of the Quran, which are far more important for our course. And I'm going to talk about one more important source for the study of Islam, and then conclude with some observations on the Western study of religion in general and Islam in particular. So the most fundamental source, primary source for understanding Islam, of course, is the Qur'an. And we've talked about the different translations. The next one is something called a hadith. And we're going to do a chapter devoted to that as well. So hadith are accounts which were originally oral. So these are now written accounts which were originally oral of a statement. In other words, something the Prophet said, or an account of something he did, or an account of something which was done in his presence, which he approved of, which he did not disapprove of. So this is what is known as the hadith, and it's a huge body of literature, thousands and thousands of pages of things which were written down and preserved in different collections known as hadith collections. And well, there are a lot of them. And there's also some distinction here between Sunnis and Shias as well. So for the Sunnis, the definition which I gave you of the hadith, that it's an account of either a statement, an action, or a tacit approval of the Prophet Muhammad. That's the Sunni definition. The Shiites will say that it's an account of a statement or an action or a tacit approval of the Prophet Muhammad or any of the 12 Imams, or Fatima, his daughter, as well. So that's a significant difference. So there's a lot of Shia hadiths because there's a lot more stuff, a lot more people whose statements and so forth have been recorded. So it's a huge body of literature. Among the Sunni Muslims, you have 6 major books of hadith, and they are known as the 6 authentic collections for the Sunni Muslims. This is a handy collection of all of them in one place, but if you open it up, it's 2 columns to a page, and it's tiny script, like a dictionary. So the 6 major collections are in this book of the Sunnis, what they call the 6 rigorously authenticated collections. The Shias have their own collections. And again, we will go into this stuff in more detail when we do the chapter on hadith. Now, there is something which is completely overlooked in this book, and that is the approach which a person like Daniel Brown takes. I did some, internet research on Daniel Brown. It's in all likelihood, he doesn't explicitly say it anywhere, but he teaches at an institution which is a kind of a Christian institution for dialogue with religions and so forth. So I imagine he is some kind of a Christian, some sort of maybe missionary as well. And so that would mean that he would at least accept the notion of religion, but it's not written from the point of view of, certainly not a believer in Islam, but it's also not written from the point of view of a believer in Christianity. It's written from the point of view of a secular person, a secular viewpoint, shall we say. And this is the great distinguishing feature about the study of religion today in general, and the study of Islam in particular, because we're talking about Islam. So you will find that most people in religious studies typically don't believe in religion of any kind. This I find to be rather peculiar. Can you imagine someone who studied chemistry but didn't believe in the atomic theory? So what I'm really trying to say is, you might say, well, you don't really have to believe in a religion to study it. I suppose, yes, that's true. But what I really would like to get at is the notion that religion is somehow a kind of quaint survival from a more simpler time. And we modern people now have progressed or evolved to the stage where we don't need these things, and we can understand how religion developed as a social and cultural phenomenon, to give people meaning in their lives and to help them get through the daily grind of existence and the hardships that are found in any and every human in the course of any and every human life. Well, actually, I think that this is a very peculiar notion, a very peculiar viewpoint, and it is an anomaly in history. It is only with modern civilization, it is only in the modern period, in the modern world, where we have an entire civilization founded upon the rejection of the idea of the holy, based upon the rejection of the idea of a sacred reality, the rejection of the idea of kind of eternal and sublime truths or eternal verities. That if the modern world has anything close to a religion, it is science or scientism. And so people put their faith in science and technology, the state, things of this kind. And the role of religion in modern life has become somewhat eclipsed. So there's a kind of secular discourse which dominates. And I think that if you take that approach, then you will miss a lot of things. I'm not saying that you have to be a Muslim to study Islam, or you have to be a Christian to study Christianity, and so on. But at least you have to have some sympathy, so to speak, rather than hostility, which I think many people do have who come from that kind of a background, albeit maybe a latent hostility. And that will not really get you very far, especially in the study of Islam, because Islam is a religion of a vast number of people, and the vast majority of Muslims still on some level or another believe in it. They really, really do. I mean, you could insult in almost any Christian country today, in the modern, certainly in the Western world, you could insult Jesus and Mary. You could put on a t-shirt saying Jesus is, bleep, 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 bleep. You could write whatever you wanted. And you could probably walk down the street in the Vatican and nobody would do anything to you. You couldn't really do that in the Muslim world. Muslims do not like that their religion should be, or religion of any kind should be insulted. And there is still a kind of profound degree of respect for religiosity and spirituality. And so the modern world is really the first instance in history, the modern civilization, of a civilization that is built on the rejection of the idea of the holy and the rejection of the notion of the secular, of the sacred, in favor of the secular. So I think this can lead to profound difficulties in the study of Islam. Also, many of the Orientalists, as they're called, the originally European and later Americans who came to study Islam, most of them came to the study of Islam from a Christian or a Jewish background. And in the case of the Christian background, they often were missionaries, or they were scholars of the higher criticism, what is known as the higher criticism of the Bible, meaning they would come from a Protestant background and they were subjecting the text of the Bible, particularly the Hebrew Bible, to an exacting kind of linguistic and historical analysis. And many of them came to the study of Arabic because of its similarity to Hebrew. Arabic and Hebrew are from the same linguistic family and they have a lot in common. So a lot of these biblical scholars started studying Arabic and so forth. So that's one sort of background. And then others were coming at it from a missionary background. And so they obviously had a certain bias or a certain agenda in learning about Muslims so they could better spread the gospel in the Muslim lands. In the modern period, this originally missionary agenda has been replaced, in the case of many scholars, by a different sort of agenda, meaning a more political one, an overtly political one, especially in the case of the United States after what has become known as 9/11. But even before that, where the study of Islam was really part of was kind of facilitating and closely related to American foreign policy objectives in the Muslim world. So there's a lot of that background which you find in Western studies on Islam, meaning this sort of secular element, which I already spoke about. In some of the very earlier works, there is this kind of bias in favor of Judeo-Christian narratives, shall we say, for want of a better term. And then very much in modern times and very recent times, various political agendas that are a reflection of American foreign policy in the Muslim world. So you need to be aware of all of that as we go forward in the course. That's pretty much all I had to say to you today in this lecture, and we will see you in the third lecture. Thank you very much for listening.